This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 1851. Finally Rented, Creating and Signing a Residential Lease Agreement by Philip Taylor of ptmoney.com. And I'm your host and personal finance enthusiast, Diana Merriam. Happy Monday. We're going to jump right into today's post and start the week as we optimize your life. Finally Rented, Creating and Signing a Residential Lease Agreement by Philip Taylor of ptmoney.com. Okay, truthfully, we didn't just rent our home, but it did take a while. We listed our home for rent in mid-June, and my tenant moved in on August 15th. It was an up and down couple of months, as I explained in previous posts. I enjoyed fixing up the rental unit, but I wasn't a big fan of finding the tenant. Once we'd gone through all of that and found our tenant, it was time to make it official, create and sign the residential lease agreement. For obvious reasons, we wanted a lease agreement. An agreement clearly lays out the terms of the contract between us, the landlord, and our renter, the tenant. An agreement gives both parties something to rely on if there's any question about how things should happen. For example, if rent's going to be paid late, the agreement should explain what constitutes late, what the late fees are, and more. We've all heard the anecdotal stories of tenants from hell. While the proper vetting up front can eliminate most of those problems, a solid agreement will ensure that legally you're protected if your good renter turns bad. Our lease agreement was also required by our homeowners association. Not only did they require us to sign one with the tenant, they gave us some verbiage to include in the agreement. Lease agreement language is going to differ from state to state, but they will likely contain some of the same basic data. I picked up my lease agreement from a friend and local lawyer who also has a rental property. He gave me his agreement and I modified it accordingly. Some of the key elements from my agreement. Term. This section defines the dates of the lease agreement. In my case, the lease runs from August 15th, 2012 to August 31st, 2014. Rent. This section states that the rent is $1,775 a month. It also states when to pay it, where to pay it, and using what method, such as direct deposit. Security deposit. This section explains that the security deposit is $1,775 or 1 month's rent, and it also defines what can be deducted from the security deposit at the end of the term. Utilities. This section makes it clear that all utilities are the responsibility of the tenant. Animals. I edited this section of the agreement to be in line with my pet policy, that is, 1 domestic cat. Late charge. This section of the agreement states that the tenant will pay me $25 a day for each day past the first of the month that the rent is not paid. Governing law. This basically states that this agreement is bound by the laws in Texas. And notice. Includes the mailing addresses where changes to the agreement should be forwarded. Nolo.com has a solid list of 10 terms to include in your lease agreement. Thankfully, I had a friend to rely on for a free residential lease agreement. If you're not so lucky, maybe you should reach out to a lawyer to have one written up. Rocket Lawyer has a free residential lease generator that looks pretty handy. I shared with you guys earlier that I used MrLandlord.com's tips for vetting tenants. He also has some example lease agreements that could prove helpful. And of course, LegalZoom can do this for you, starting at around $25. You can also check with a lawyer on Just Answer for more advice about leases if you want. When I was going through the process of turning our home into a real estate investment, I found that it was good to have the lease agreement ready. In most cases, a prospective tenant wanted to look at the lease to make sure they were comfortable with all of the terms. Most tenants were concerned with what happens if they had to break the lease. The lease signing was fairly straightforward. I met the tenant on August 12th. We reviewed the property and agreement one last time. We both signed and I immediately photographed the lease and emailed copies to each party. To my knowledge, you cannot legally require the first month's rent and security deposit until the move-in date, so we did not exchange money when we signed the lease. My tenant paid both on the 15th, his move-in date, or as the lease agreement defines it, commencement date. I had, however, previously collected a holding deposit of $500 so that I could feel comfortable taking the property off the market temporarily. Since the signing, all has gone well with the tenant. It's been very quiet. Seems the hard work spent vetting the tenant is paying off. You just listened to the post titled Finally Rented, Creating and Signing a Residential Lease Agreement by Philip Taylor of ptmoney.com. I've heard from my friends who own rental properties that vetting tenants is critical when it comes to real estate investing. This process typically looks like verifying that their income is 3 times the rent, as well as reviewing their credit score and confirming that there were no past evictions, collections, or bankruptcies. Background checks also reveal if the applicants have been convicted of any crimes. And from everything I've seen, landlord references from prior rentals are a huge help. As someone who was a renter for a decade of my life, I wish it was more commonplace to ask landlords for references from their previous tenants. It could have saved me some headaches. In addition to the elements outlined in this article for what should be in the lease agreement, here are some other points I have looked for as a tenant. It's good to know if subletting is permitted. This is the key reason I left my last apartment in Brooklyn. They wouldn't let me sublet, and I knew I was going away for 2 months that year, so it was a deal breaker for me. And with that apartment, I also wish I would have read the lease more closely in terms of pest control. The entire building was overrun by cockroaches. And while the lease said this was the responsibility of the landlord, and the landlord did come and spray and bomb my apartment, he refused to hire a professional exterminator. The problem was only fixed after I paid for an exterminator myself. Whether you're a landlord or a tenant, the lease is there to protect both sides and clearly set expectations, so make sure you read it carefully. And that's a wrap for another Monday show. Have a great rest of your day and start to your week, and I'll be back tomorrow as usual, where your optimal life awaits.